My name is Melinda Gibson. I have the pleasure this year of being the editor of The Voice for AAFDC. It's voice.aafdc, but if you're watching this, you probably already know that. So I want to move quickly on to thank our sponsors, Brink.com, which is providing our video equipment and videography, I guess I should say. We don't say videotaping anymore. And we're pleased to be here, and we work in Chinatown, overlooking Clyde's and the Verizon Center. I want to introduce you this afternoon to Joe Camacho, who is the CMO of Sabio Mobile. And Joe is going to talk to us about millennials, multiculturals, and mobile, and how to reach them. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Melinda. Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. It's always great when I'm in the nation's capital, and I find it really interesting to be around a lot of really smart, motivated people, and it's always a pleasure to be here with you. I want to speak with you today about connecting with Latinos, and it's interesting because in conversations I've had within different industries, different verticals, there's a unique perspective of growing up in Southern California and in San Diego. I was born and raised in San Diego my entire life. I've been, you could say, surrounded by Mexicans my entire life. And I was raised in a home where my father spoke 3 languages. He's from the island of Guam originally, and my mother's from Mexico. She's bilingual and speaks English and Spanish. And so I was raised speaking English to my father, Spanish to my mother, in a very Mexican home, because we were only 8 miles from the border, and crossing the Mexican border back and forth on a weekly basis to go shopping or go to restaurants. That is an experience that's very unique to Southern California, that is just part of our life and part of Southern California culture. I'd also like to talk about, Sabio Mobile as a company. So as a company, we reach many people in the entire country on mobile devices, right? We serve ads for our advertisers, which include Ford, McDonald's, Procter & Gamble, Toyota, just to name a few. About 20% of our business is Hispanic focused. There's a big push among all of these companies to how to reach the Latino consumer. And here in DC, I came to speak to individuals within the political vertical, how to reach Latino voters, right? And so I wanted to make just a few points, a few takeaways that I hope you guys will take today. One is multicultural, and we're talking the Latino market, the Hispanic market today. It's growing. It's continuing to grow. We've probably all heard the statistics of how fast the Hispanic market is growing, how it's becoming more and more part of the American fabric. It's growing in its buying power, in its influence, in both politics, in business, in art, music, theater. I mean, when you think about it, the Pope is a Latino, right? And so the influence of the Hispanic community in our country, I don't think people realize how much so, right? Even in as the nation developed, the oldest city in the country is a Spanish city, right? So the dollar bill, the dollar symbol that we have, the money we have in our pocket, that is a Spanish symbol that started, and it became a symbol of the American dollar. So that influence has been happening for centuries, and it's going to continue to grow and grow and grow. Another interesting takeaway is that the rapidly growing Hispanic community is largely millennial and younger. It is a very young demographic. So it's growing, it's young, and that being the case, the way they consume media is changing the way young people consume media today. Television viewership is going down. Mobile consumption is increasing very rapidly as well. I wanted to touch on a few points about growth, right? In 1980, about 15 million Americans were of Hispanic descent. 6.4% of the U.S. population. 1 in 16 was Hispanic in 1980. Today, there are 55 million Hispanics, representing 1.5 by 2020. It's estimated to be $1.7 trillion in purchasing power, and that's why the big brands, the big companies, they see that that's where the growth is at, and that's where a lot of the advertising spend is going towards the Hispanic community. Another interesting point is that the average household size of a Hispanic family is 3.4 versus 2.4 for non-Hispanic whites. So we have larger households, growing in our purchasing power and in numbers. Now in the future, it's estimated by 2060 that the Hispanic population will reach 135 million. 1 in 3 Hispanics is 1 in 3 Americans, is estimated to be Hispanic by the year 2060. You'll see that on this map, those are counties with the fastest growth rate. What used to be mostly a Southwest United States, right, where Hispanics were concentrated, it's growing rapidly to the north. In fact, the fastest growing states, triple-digit growth, is being seen in states like Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, and some into the Northeast as well.
Hey Joe, somebody asked me the question yesterday.
Sure.
You mean citizens, right? And these are American citizens.
Well, I'm going to get to that point
Okay.
now. So within, when you talk about the size of the Hispanic community, right, there is that question is being asked, how many of those are U.S. citizens? How many are immigrants that are maybe undocumented, right? So I'll get to that point. Now that number, that's U.S. Census data, so they don't really, because not everyone answers that answer, right? So the question is how accurate is that? Now that's up to 2060. If you look at the growth, you ask yourself, so what is the source of the growth? Where's the growth coming from? And so what we found is that the share of the growth, if you will, right, is being done by U.S. born Hispanics as opposed to foreign born Hispanics. This slide here, it shows that the non-Hispanic white population is declining in the country, and the share of the Hispanic population is increasing. So that's where you'll see the 135 million by 2060. It's estimated that by 2045, the non-Hispanic white population will be the minority in the country. As the African American community grows, Asian American community grows, it's going to continue to grow, and it'll be balanced at that point in terms of majority minority by 2045. I mentioned the growth of the Hispanic community, right? The Hispanic segment. And up until about 1990, much of the share of the growth was occurring because of immigration. So first generation Hispanics were immigrating to the United States in larger numbers than US born Hispanics in terms of the growth. But since then, nearly for the past 27 years, nearly 30 years, that shifted. So that now the growth is taking place, immigration has gone down, and the US born Hispanic population is growing and growing and growing. Now, I had a conversation earlier this morning with a consultant from Mexico. We were talking about this, about how people emigrate to the US and what is the cause. And we both agree that, economic conditions have changed, in particular northern Mexico, where many of the big industrial cities like Monterrey or Tijuana, Hermosillo, those cities have grown, they've become very wealthy. Economic conditions have changed for much of the middle class in Mexico and Chile and other parts of Latin America. Higher birth rates, right, here in our country. So we have a bigger household and the birth rates are higher. So that share, again, US born Hispanics are growing and they're the reason for the growth. Immigration policies is another issue, right? As immigration policies change or maybe become a little more stringent, that does affect the first generation Hispanic coming to the United States. As we look forward in terms of that share, what we see is that that's going to continue for decades to come. So you'll see that what's driving the growth, again, is US born Hispanics. The U.S. Hispanic is a very diverse group, right? There are Afro-Latinos, there are Asian Latinos, there are white Latinos, there are so many different types of, when someone says that they're a Latino, it's not a race, it's a cultural identity, right? My cousin, Norma Nakashima, is of Japanese Mexican descent. Her great-grandfather came from Japan, and she lives in Guadalajara, to give you an example. My friend Carlos Chung lives in Los Angeles. His grandfather, he's from Chile, but his grandfather was Chinese. So he's a Chinese Latino. There are parts of Mexico where they're, just like we're in Chinatown here, I can take you to parts of Mexico where it is Chinatown. And they have, just like you would in San Francisco, like an underground, a whole other city, there's a part like in Mexicali where you have Chinese Mexicans that have been there for 100 years, that have built a large section of the city, and they have restaurants and all these like alleyways and things, so it's a whole different culture, but they are Latinos. They happen to be Chinese Latinos. Now, interestingly, when asked about racial identification, 65% of the U.S. Hispanic population identifies as white. About a third identify as other, but when they select to pick a racial identity, about 65% select white as a racial identifier. Country of origin. U.S. Hispanic, again, is very diverse, right? But the large percentage, almost 2/3 of U.S. Hispanics are from Mexico or of Mexican descent. Again, I'm from San Diego in Southern California. That's largely the case. I find it really interesting when I come to Washington, D.C., because I always ask when I meet other Latinos, where are you from? You know, I'm looking for all my Mexican people. And I'm finding that here in D.C., Salvadoreños from El Salvador or from Guatemala, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, the same with New York, of course, you know, Puerto Rican and Dominican. So depending on where in the country you're at, you're going to see larger share of different groups that have tended to migrate to that area. The Mexican community is growing everywhere. You know, whether you're in Chicago, right, or parts of, you know, even in Tennessee, where my wife is from, you'll find that the Mexican community is growing very much. Another interesting point, you know, and I brought this up simply to make, you know, for people to understand that maybe your perspective or the things that we assume, right, sometimes aren't necessarily the case. We assume that all Latinos are Catholic, or a very large percentage are Catholic. The reality, there's a large Protestant population amongst the Latino community. And I use this slide just to show that the Catholic religion amongst U.S. Hispanics is actually declining, while other groups, in this case, there was a 12% loss in 4 years, where the evangelical community amongst U.S. Hispanics has increased by 4%. They're very young. So the U.S. Hispanic population is much younger than other groups. The average age of a U.S. Hispanic is 28 years old when compared to 43 for a non-Hispanic white. But that's the total U.S. Hispanic population, right? What about U.S.-born Hispanics? And the U.S.-born Hispanic, the average age is 18 years old. That is how young the Hispanic segment is. About 25%, this is really interesting, about 25% of all millennials in the country are Hispanic. 25%, nearly a quarter of all millennials are Hispanic.
You know, it's like, could you repeat that?
Yeah, I know some of these numbers because and it's interesting, you know, because we were talking earlier about being raised in Southern California, where I'm used to being around a lot of Mexicans, right? You know, I was talking with someone yesterday. I said, you know, I grew up. Our doctor was Mexican. The banker was Mexican. My dentist was Mexican. And I said, okay, so my lawyer, he was Jewish, but he was a Jewish Mexican. So I just find it interesting that the perspective, depending on where you're from, right, and what part of the country and how you were raised, that it can give you a different just a very different perspective as to who the community, the Hispanic community is, and how they feel and think, and those kinds of, about certain issues. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it also assumed that they're bilingual?
Well, in terms of the bilingual U.S. Hispanic, so second generation like myself, I was raised speaking 2 languages, so yes. The U.S. born second generation is the largest percentage of the bilingual U.S. Hispanic. But what happens is third generation and beyond, they start losing the language. Whether they were German when they came, or the Italians that came, anyone who comes to the country, right, it just happens that wherever our ancestors came from, the second generation that was born in the U.S., they're bilingual. But by the third generation, they start losing the language. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a cultural affinity. That doesn't mean they're not Latinos. It doesn't mean that they don't, feel Latino because they don't speak the language. But it does mean that in terms of how you communicate with them is very, very different, right? By 2026, it's estimated that the majority of adults, 18 to 24, the majority of 18 to 24-year-olds will be non-white, whether they're African American or Hispanic or Asian Americans. But young people are very multicultural. And so being multicultural, and you're talking about the influencers, whether it's theater like Hamilton, or music, whether it's Shakira or other influencers, if you will. Again, the multicultural group is having an influence, and particularly amongst young people, right? Younger people today are very open to new foods and new things and listening to new music, and we have access. I say we because I'm a young guy too, right? But younger people, they have access to so much to share, and it's really opened up a whole new world to so many young people, which is amazing.
And does it also tie into the pursuit of experiences over assets? Because a lot of young people feel like owning a home is not really going to happen for them, so the money that they would spend on that mortgage or that down payment, they're now spending on experiences and travel and and eating out, and,
Absolutely. Yeah, things have changed for sure. I think that people are traveling a lot more. I was at a conference, and I heard an individual. I'm trying to remember his name. Very influential. I apologize, but he made a comment. He studies trends, and he wrote a book years ago about trends that was very famous. And I apologize, I can't remember his name right now. But he made a point where he said we are living longer, right? About 10 years in terms of our parents, the difference, we are living longer. So the question is, what are we doing with those 10 years? And what's happening is you're seeing that he made the point that young people are prolonging a lot of the things that our parents used to make, the kinds of decisions they used to make, like buying a home and getting married and having children. They used to do that in their early 20s, whereas now they're adolescents longer. They're traveling more. They're having more experiences as opposed to having assets, right? And then the other 5 years, he's saying that are being experienced when they're older, when individuals are older in retirement. So how do marketers take that data, right, of America that has longer years to live? What are they doing with those younger, those years in their youth? It is changing, absolutely, for sure. To that point, Hispanics are called the super consumers, and in this case, I was talking to some individuals who were in the political space, that they're the super constituents and super consumers, if you will. They're much younger, they're living longer, and when you look at the effective years of purchasing power or effective years of voting, right, they have the highest number of effective years of purchasing power. 54 years compared to, let's say, the Asian community, which is 50. So they have the highest years of consumption. They're younger and they live longer. Another point I want to make is that English is the language that is spoken by most Hispanics. Now again, assumptions that some people make, marketers in particular, when they want to reach the quote-unquote Hispanic community, they will say, well, we're going to advertise in Spanish. The problem with that is that you're not connecting with the majority of the Hispanic community. What you're doing is you're connecting with the percentage that is Spanish dominant, first generation, and largely older. So as generations rise, we were talking about this earlier, the use of English increases in terms of the proficiency.
What about marketing with Spanglish, like mixture of both? Is that effective, or is that kind of another trend that will be eventually sort of aged out as?
But see, you're cheating because you already saw my notes, and that's exactly where I'm going to go.
Oh, okay, cool.
But yes, you're right. That's what I wanted to do, is share with you how to reach them, how to communicate with Latinos. What is McDonald's doing, right? What does Wells Fargo and other clients that we have, how are they doing it, and how are they doing it right? And so I want to be able to share that with you here today. So in the digital space, English is by far the language of preference, including Hispanics that are Spanish dominant that speak some English, but they're still consuming much of their media in English. And it's because, you know, we've had this conversation in the past within the company and others. Is it because, largely because the media is just better in English? There's a lot more variety, right? So whether you're reading news or watching things or any videos or movies, it's just better content. And we think that is the case. That's why a lot of the digital consumption is being done, because the media is better. But the other driver is they're consuming digital media because they're a lot younger. And being younger, they're used to they're largely bilingual, or they are actually English dominant. So, how do you reach Latinos? It's by having the right mix of message, messenger, and media. I want to start with media because Sabio Mobile, it is a way that we have found that reaches consumers and voters in a very effective way, because that's where the eyeballs are, right? That's where you can reach people. Well, that's what they're using, that's what they're watching. So the consumption of television is continuing to go down. Radio, print, of course, those things, the consumption is going down. Digital is increasing. But even among digital media consumption, you'll find that mobile share is continuing to grow. You'll see that here on the right, while television is consistently going down, you're seeing digital increase, but mobile share of that increase, mobile versus desktop, mobile share is growing exponentially. So we can, I'm sure if you ask anyone in this building or within a mile radius, how many of them have a Walkman in their pocket, right? It's probably zero. There may be one, right? But how many of us have a smartphone in our pocket or in our briefcase or within reach 24 hours a day? I would bet to say it's in the high 90% of definitely almost 100% of everyone in this building. Mm-hmm. And so mobile is growing very rapidly, and it's where the eyeballs are. Legacy pay TV is going down with, as you see subscription over-the-top services, for example, like Netflix and Amazon, that are not ad supported, right? As we are able to consume what we want, when we want to see it, how we want to see it on any device, and be able to, I could watch a movie literally and go anywhere I want and watch the movie, sit in the park and watch a movie if I wanted to. So it's amazing that ability to do that is affecting television viewership. And so television viewership is going down as mobile is increasing. You'll see that it looks like it's past its peak, It is going down. Doesn't look like it's coming back anytime soon. Where it's having the biggest effect, it is generational, right? It is looking at television viewership among young people is going down. Again, it's decreasing very rapidly. You'll see again, it's a generational shift. So the younger the demo, the more mobile they're using, and the less television they're watching. So there is a correlation between age groups and the use of mobile devices. Within that space, so the Hispanic space is the whole country is watching less television and consuming more mobile. Hispanics over-index with mobile. Now, when it comes to ownership, that was the case a few years ago where they had a much higher share of ownership of devices, but we're reaching saturation where almost everyone has a cell phone, and smartphone ownership amongst that share is growing as well. Where the difference lies is how we use it. So Hispanics are over-indexing with, for example, using a smartphone as their primary internet access point. There are more and more cord cutters, people cutting their landlines, their subscription, so pay TV, they're cutting cords. And so as they're consuming more and more media on mobile devices, what we're finding is that Hispanics are doing so even more so. Right. Here you'll see that within select devices, weekly time spent with select media devices, I want you to notice Hispanic, that consuming on apps and web via smartphone, that's the second highest. Now, but if you look at the averages here for the total, Hispanics are consuming more media on a smartphone than average, so they are higher than average, they over-index, and they're watching less television than average, so they are underperforming in terms of television viewership. So back to the point, viewership is decreasing, and consuming media on a mobile device is increasing. In the past, during this past cycle, the 26 election, right? Sometimes when you hear the talking heads, it's almost as if immigration is an issue that is the top of mind for all Hispanics. But in reality, it's not at the top. It's very important, but it ranks fifth. Like most of us, right? If you ask any American voter, what is the most important? It is the economy. It's about jobs. And so the Hispanic community is showing that as well, that is how they feel about the issues. So the top issue was the economy, and then from there it's about even in terms of healthcare, terrorism, so national security, education, immigration. While again it is important, it has a share of 80% in terms of 80% of them found it to be very important. It is not the top issue. So I talked about reaching the Latino consumer and voter with the right mix of message, messenger, and media. And so we talked about media and how television viewership is decreasing, mobile is increasing, but what about the message and the messenger? And this is, I'm getting near the end of the presentation, and I simply wanted to talk about a few things that I thought were really important. Because while the Hispanic community is very diverse, socially, economically, racially, it's a very diverse group. You have, you have Hispanic billionaires, and then you have farm workers in the Central Valley of California. So there is there's a lot of diversity, right? Very different socioeconomic conditions that have affected the Hispanic community. From rich to poor, black to white, Latinos are very diverse. But there are a few things that we all have in common. There are a few things that I feel that is very important, that when brands or political campaigns, when they're trying to reach Latinos, I call them the 4 Fs, right? Los 4 Fs. And those are faith, family, food, and friends. And I want to take just a second to talk about something that within this these 4 pillars of communicating with the Hispanic community is something that I want to talk about. It's respect, right? And I wanted to make some interesting observations. For example, when it comes to faith, I'm not suggesting that in an ad campaign you have to, it's got to be an ad with the priest in the background and church bells ringing. I'm not suggesting that. I'm simply saying that within the messaging, understanding how faith is important to Latinos, right? To give you an example, so in our country here, it's very normal to hear someone use the name of my Lord, right, as if it's a curse word. You hear it all the time. You hear it on television, you hear it in movies. You hear Jesus, but they say it in a way that is like if instead of some other curse word, that's the name they're using. I find it very offensive, and so do many other people that I know. But what's interesting is that Hispanics in the Spanish language, we don't have an equivalent. We don't use that name or his name, or we don't say God. We don't use faith in a disrespectful way. So it's about, I'm not saying that all Latinos are, again, ringing church bells, but it's a way to communicate by understanding, to have respect, right, about their faith, because it's an important part of life. Whether they go to church or not, they're still baptizing and having a big family event with baptisms or other things that, marriage, for example. It's a big church celebration for many Hispanics. The other is family. Now, an example I will give is, years ago, when I was much younger, I was in the Marine Corps. I spent 6 years in the United States Marine Corps. And I'll never forget, I was right out of basic training, and I was in what's called A school, so I was going through an electronics school. And I'm hanging out with my buddies, other Marines. We're drinking beers, and they started saying, and I don't mean to be offensive, but they started saying, "Your mama jokes." And these guys were from all over the country, right? And they were saying, "Your mama this and your mama that," and they were all laughing. They thought it was really funny. But I made a point, immediately I drew a line, and I told them, I says, "Look, it may be cool for you guys to do that where you're from, but where I'm from, don't talk about my mother." I said, "If you talk about my mother, I swear we're gonna throw down." So, they were like, "Dude, what?" And I explained, it's just, hey, it's part of my culture, it's the way I was raised. We don't talk that way. In Latin America, in Mexico, if you want to throw down with somebody, all you have to do is just start insulting their mother, and I guarantee you, it's going to get ugly. So back to my point of respect is that, and this is more of a political, right, for political consultants and messaging, is that immigration. Is that if you don't show respect to the immigrants, if you don't show respect to the people that came before us, right, it's like if you're talking about my mother. Or my grandfather, or our uncles that are the salt of the earth. They're the kindest, hardest working, most amazing people that I never knew. And when you're insulting immigrants, you're talking about people that, all around me, that are the best among us, right? So I think that within the messaging, people should be aware of that, how respect for our faith and our family is very, very important to us.
That's a good sort of juxtaposition between immigration as an issue and immigrants as people. And so that part of importance to the Hispanic community, it's more on the people as immigrants versus immigration as an issue.
Yeah, I agree. I think, when you talk about the issue, I mean, policymakers can have a discussion about what is smart and right and what is beneficial to the country. I'm not saying we should have just open borders and no, I don't think anyone thinks that. Not that I know of. I don't know anyone who believes that. But the Latinos that I know are very sensitive when you start talking disrespectfully to immigrants wherever they're from, whether they're from Somalia or Latin America or Asia or Europe, because it feels like, oh, you're talking about my mother. So that's the point I wanted to make, is that it is it can be a very personal thing when someone is as if they're not people, right? And I hope that this takeaway, and that any kind of messaging, communication that you do when reaching Latinos can that'll help you think about that.